Amendments Act 2020. Following the orders passed on Thursday, virtual participation in questions, urgent question and statement is allowed for certain honourable members. I have reintroduced a complete call list for questions, and so honourable members should not rise to try and catch my eye. They should only rise when called. Where a substantive question is asked by an honourable member participating virtually, I will ask the Minister to answer the question and then call the honourable member to ask their supplementary. We now come to questions Secretary of State for the Home Department. Come to number 1, Sir Edward David.
Number 1, sir.
Secretary of State.
Mr. Speaker, the government has made it our priority to protect the vulnerable through this national emergency, but we do not believe it necessary to suspend the NRPF condition to do so. It is right, Mr. Speaker, that migrants coming to the UK are financially independent. However, practical support such as rent protections and the Coronavirus Job Retention Scheme apply to those NRPF conditions, and we have allocated more than £3.2 billion to local authorities and £750 million to charities to support the most vulnerable.
Mr. Speaker, the Home Secretary doesn't get it. People who've worked here, paid taxes here for years, are being denied support and are falling into destitution. People who've lost their jobs or seen their income slashed can be excluded from the very protections the Home Secretary cites. So, Mr. Speaker, given that this rule disproportionately impacts people in our black and minority ethnic communities the hardest, will the Home Secretary now suspend the no recourse to public funds rule for the duration of the pandemic?
I thank the Right Honourable Gentleman for his question and his comments. The answer is no. Local authorities have provided a basic safety net, and that is through significant financial provisions introduced by the government and a range of measures to support those people that have been working. And because of coronavirus, because of this national health pandemic, the situation we find ourselves in, will support people with no recourse to public funds. And that assistance is being given under the Coronavirus Retention Scheme and also the Self-Employed Income Support Scheme. So these funds are available. And if I may, Mr. Speaker, it is wrong to imply that safety nets are not in place. Local authorities, and I hope he will pay tribute to local authorities, who throughout this pandemic and this crisis have been resourced to an extra £3.2 billion to provide vital financial help.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. On the 26th of March, further to the comments the Home Secretary has just made, MHCLG ministers wrote to all councils asking them to utilise alternative powers and funding to assist those with no recourse to public funds. So it would seem that the government has understood that NRPF is counterproductive during the pandemic in principle, but the lack of clarity from the Home Office on this in practice means that people are still facing destitution. With this in mind, will the Home Secretary look again at the spirit of the Prime Minister's comments to the Liaison Committee and outline how they intend to support those families?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think it's important to place on record that, of course, this isn't just the Home Office. We work across government and obviously MHCLG. The Department of Local Government and Communities are central to this. And in terms of the resources that have been provided, practical support such as rent protections and the Coronavirus Job Retention Scheme apply to those under the no recourse to public funds conditions, but also the Honourable Lady mentioned specifically MHCLG and local authorities, £3.2 billion, and I've been working directly with the Secretary of State for MHCLG, and in fact I've also been part of discussions with the devolved administrations as well, throughout this whole period, throughout the last 10 weeks, looking at the protective measures and the support that can be provided through the resources provided from central government.
Joanna Cherry.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Black Lives Matter movement and Public Health England's COVID-19 outbreak review of disparities in risks and outcomes have highlighted the inequalities suffered by black and minority ethnic people in our society. Does the Home Secretary accept that the no recourse to public funds policy disproportionately affects people from BAME communities?
Yeah, exactly.
And if she does, why won't she push for it to be suspended as a concrete step towards tackling the inequalities which so appall many of our constituents?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There are a number of points that I'd like to make to the Honourable Lady. First of all, the government published its report last week into the impact of coronavirus on Black, Asian, minority ethnic communities. The findings are indeed shocking, and it is right that the government invests its time and resources through the Equalities Minister in particular to look at the measures that can be brought in place. Now, this policy of no recourse to public funds is one of many policies, and it is right as a government that we look at all policies that affect all communities in the round without singling one particular policy out.
Glad to hear that the Home Secretary is looking at the policy, but I would urge her to read a report that came out this time last year by Agnes Woolley called The Cost of the No Recourse to Public Funds Policy. It found that most families with no recourse to public funds in the United Kingdom have at least one child who is British by birth, and nearly all of those families are Black and minority ethnic. Accordingly, no recourse to public funds is inherently more likely to affect BAME British children than white British children. So given this evidence that no recourse to public funds is a policy with racially discriminatory impacts, why won't she accept that it needs to go?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. If I may, I think it's wrong to characterise as a policy of racially discriminatory. It is a fact, however, if I may, it is a fact that for all communities and people of all backgrounds, there are many measures in place in terms of protections, financial through the safety net of the welfare state. In addition, Mr. Speaker, when it comes to children, also the funds that are being made available through the Department of Education in terms of pupil premium, there are a plethora of support packages that are combined collectively based upon the individual needs and individual circumstances. And it is right that we treat individuals, people as individuals, and not just categorise them. Now, I think it is important, Mr. Speaker, to recognise that there are a number of issues, there are a plethora of issues that affect people from Black, Asian, ethnic minority communities, but we cannot assume that there is a one-size-fits-all approach or a single policy solution to address those issues. And it is right, as I've already indicated, Mr. Speaker, that my honourable friend, the Minister for Equalities, looks at the report that was published last week, and the government provides a collective response to the many challenges facing the community.
5 withdrawn, so we go straight to Aaron Bell.
Number 2, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank my friend for his question. My department is working extremely closely with the police and the fire and rescue services, as he will be aware, to ensure that they receive all the support that they need, PPE, throughout this COVID-19 outbreak.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Thank the Home Secretary for her answer. Could I also take this opportunity to put on record my support for the police and my sympathies to those who have been injured in the police in the last few days. Also in Staffordshire, I believe the police have done a fantastic job throughout the COVID-19 outbreak. We've got one of the lowest quantities of fines in the country. That's because they've been policing with consent and with the good sense of the people of Newcastle-under-Lyme and the county more widely. But on the PPE point, it's my understanding from them that they are expecting to be reimbursed for the supplies that they have got. They have sufficient supplies. Could the Home Secretary confirm that this will be the case?
Can I thank my honourable friend for his question? And of course, he represents a constituency that I'm familiar with as well. And the work of both his local resilience forum, his police chief constable and police officers and staff throughout the pandemic has been exemplary. It really has. And I want to put on the record my praise for them. With regards to PPE supplies, it is my understanding that the force have obviously achieved sufficient supplies. That is something we've been working with working on a national level. And the government has previously indicated that forces should be reimbursed for expenditure, and obviously we'll be working across government on that.
We now come to the next question from Bim Afolobi.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Question number 3.
Minister Malthouse.
Mr. Speaker, stealing someone's tools is a particularly rotten kind of crime. Not only does it deprive them of their belongings, which is bad enough, but it also often deprives them of their livelihood, notwithstanding the inconvenience it causes to them and to their employers. We're determined to do something about this, which is why I recently convened a group of people from the industry and policing to look at what more we can do to help, and we're spending £25 million on our Safer Streets Fund to drive down exactly this kind of acquisitive crime.
I thank the Minister for his response. Would he join me in championing the use of modern technology to combat tool theft? like the Tool Watch app designed by Harpenden residents Denise and Alan Brett. This technology makes each tool traceable and can help police fight this crime. Would you take this opportunity to champion Tool Watch and help spread its usage throughout the police forces throughout the country?
Well, Mr. Speaker, the Honourable Gentleman is one of the most original thinkers in the House, and therefore it's no surprise that he champions innovation in all things, including crime fighting. So yes, he's absolutely right. There's lots more we can do harnessing technology to fight crime, and I'd be very interested when we get back to normal to go and visit his constituents and see Tool Watch for myself, so that we can take it and promote it to the industry more generally.
Sir John Hayes.
Question 4, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my right honourable friend for that question. He, of course, has very long experience of matters such as this in the Home Office and elsewhere. On the 1st of January, for the first time in decades, the United Kingdom will have full democratic control over our immigration system, giving us power to determine who comes here and for how long. We do not intend to impose a cap, but our points-based system will make sure that only those with the skills our country needs come to the United Kingdom, and it is our expectation that total migration as a consequence will reduce.
John Hayes.
Mr. Speaker, with the post-COVID economy facing unprecedented challenges and the prospect of job losses, in the same spirit that the Home Secretary showed in condemning this weekend's wicked violence, will the Minister look again at the resident labour market test, which means jobs have to be offered here before they can be filled from abroad? Rebuilding Britain means backing British workers, Mr. Speaker.
Well, my right honourable friend is of course correct that we want to encourage as many people as we possibly can from the UK to take up job opportunities that are available. Our objective ultimately is to see a full rate of employment. We've laid out the points-based test that will apply from the 1st of January of next year, making sure that only people with high skills can come here. But of course, it is up to this House and this Parliament to keep that under review on an ongoing basis to make sure we are striking the right balance in the way that he's describing.
I'm grateful for all the Home Secretary is doing to bring in this new policy, which I hope brings higher wages and higher skills. But doesn't it also require tougher enforcement against the dreadful people traffickers who are making money out of making a mockery of our laws and undermining all that we stand for?
Well, my right honourable friend is absolutely correct. People trafficking and people smuggling is a shocking offence that causes untold human misery. Last year, immigration enforcement made, I think, 259 arrests in connection with people smuggling and secured 101 criminal convictions. But I would like to assure my right honourable friend this is an area where we can, must and will go a great deal further.
Caroline Nancy.
Question 10. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Home Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, domestic abuse is a horrific crime that shatters the lives of those affected. We are working closely with domestic abuse organisations, the Domestic Abuse Commissioner and the police to ensure that the help and support continues to be available, and more so while the COVID-19 restrictions apply as they currently do.
Answer.
Mr. Speaker, and thank you, my right honourable friend, for her commitment to work in this area. 1 in 4 perpetrators are repeat offenders, as many as 6 different victims for others. In that light, does my right honourable friend agree with me that greater uptake of DRIVE, an intensive intervention programme aimed at perpetrators, could save lives, change the narrative and break the generational cycle which sees children raised in homes where they've witnessed abuse go on in later life to be at greater risk themselves of becoming either abuser or victim?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I wholeheartedly agree with my honourable friend, and she has highlighted many of the challenges but also issues, but also the opportunities in terms of how we can work with partner organisations to provide the right kind of support that is needed to tackle the root causes of domestic abuse, and also to protect children but also educate them in terms of their own safeguarding. There are many opportunities through which this government is doing that right now so that we can ensure we tackle this heinous crime. The landmark Domestic Abuse Abuse Bill, which began its committee stage on the 4th of June, is a significant opportunity to put this in law to transform our response to domestic abuse, but importantly provide the support, the crucial and critical support to victims and bring the perpetrators to justice.
11 and 12 withdrawn. We now come to Shadow Home Secretary Nick Thomas.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I know that following this session there will be a statement on the events of the weekend, so I will address those matters then. On domestic abuse, which is the subject of this question, I would like to welcome the fact that the government responded to the calls of those on these benches and campaigning charities on the need for a funding package for the sector. Labour called for £75 million for domestic abuse services specifically, with specialist services such as those for migrant women protected. Can the Home Secretary confirm how much of this investment has reached the front line?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Right Honourable Gentleman will be well aware of the funding packages that the Home Office, along with MHCLG and the MOJ, put towards the Treasury recently. But what I can say, Mr. Speaker, in terms of the money that has reached the frontline support organisations who are running key services and vital services, including helplines, chat functions, and improving their own technological capabilities, so far £1.2 million has been allocated to date to 13 organisations specifically for this COVID-19 response to help expand helplines, online capability, and of course provide the additional support guidance so that victims can continue to access the support that they need.
Nick Thomas.
Well, £1.2 million of support for helplines is obviously very welcome, but it's a tiny proportion of the overall £75 million, and that really does need to reach where it is needed as soon as possible. As of 2019, 1 in 6 refuges had closed since 2010, and local authority spending as a consequence of austerity had fallen from £31.2 million to £23.9 million in 2017, resulting in 60% of women being turned away from refuges for lack of spaces. Now, that simply isn't good enough. Can the Home Secretary, even if she doesn't know the specific figure today, go away and confirm that she will do all that she can to ensure that the money that's been announced actually reaches the front line? Yes, we do have the Domestic Abuse Bill coming through Parliament, but we cannot legislate our way out of this alone. That money is needed now.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Honourable Gentleman is absolutely right about the money that is required to go to frontline services, which is why, and he did ask of the £76 million, the amount of funding that has been allocated to domestic abuse. As I've indicated, it's split across 3 departments. The Ministry of Justice has itself received £15 million for the work with local domestic abuse charities through the criminal justice system. But his specific question was about the need for refuges, refuge provision, and obviously the Department for Local Government and Communities will be allocating £10 million to domestic abuse safe accommodation services. It is important that we all recognise that is where the demand is. Throughout this very difficult period, Mr. Speaker, where refugees have found it difficult to operate, there have been a widespread of measures that we as government, in our engagement with them, directly with the Commissioner as well for domestic abuse and the Victims Commissioner, have deliberately sought to find practical means and support for the front line, specifically to support them throughout this emergency.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Just building on my right honourable friend's answer to the question on refuges, something that COVID-19 has also highlighted is, despite the best efforts of the staff in our refuges across the country, including in the North West, many of those who've sought refuge there, including their children, in some circumstances, haven't had access always to a good internet connection, often a lifeline to them, and particularly for children who need education. As we start to roll out the broadband across the country to fulfil our manifesto commitment, will my right honourable friend commit to looking at refuges as one of those who should be at the front of the queue to make sure that this is something that people know will be there should they seek that sanctuary?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My right honourable friend makes a vital and very important point. I've seen for myself, actually, working with Refuge and other third-party organisations in the domestic abuse space, the amazing work that they do in terms of internet safety within refuges. And I think we must always put first and foremost the safety of the victims within the environments that they are living. But he's right to highlight that without the internet, too many, including children, are cut off, and obviously that has a hindrance to them in terms of their own development. development and their own well-being. I will absolutely take a suggestion away with me and ensure that as we build greater internet safety provisions in refuges for domestic abuse victims, we also think about what more can we do to give them the right kind of safeguards, but the right provision.
Dr. Julian Lewis.
Number 16, Mr. Speaker.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, I'm very glad my honourable friend has raised this question. We should be... Oh, but I beg your pardon. Could I, with your permission, Mr. Speaker, group this with questions number 17 and 18? Very kind, Mr. Speaker. I do apologise for overlooking that. So I'm very glad this question has arisen. We should be absolutely clear that these crossings of the English Channel are extremely dangerous. They're crossing the busiest shipping lines in the world. They are facilitated by criminal gangs who are ruthlessly exploiting vulnerable people. And the crossings are entirely unnecessary because France is a safe country and France has a very well established and functioning asylum system. We are therefore working around the clock with our French counterparts to stop these illegally facilitated crossings, sharing intelligence between the NCA here and the French authorities, and working with the French to prevent on the beach embarkations taking place on an around-the-clock basis.
Dr. Julian Lewis.
Well, that's a very clear answer as far as it goes, but it does appear to be the case that French patrol boats are escorting these dangerously overloaded inflatables across the channel until they reach English waters, whereupon, or I should say UK waters, whereupon our patrol boats pick up the occupants and ferry them to our shores. Now, I understand that this is because we have to save people who've put themselves and sometimes their families at serious risk at sea. But how can we remove perverse incentives to behave in such a dangerous fashion?
Well, it's worth emphasising that where boats get into difficulties in French waters, for example, if their engine breaks down, then the French will pick them up and take them back to France. We must, of course, as the Honourable Gentleman says, be very mindful of safety at life, but we are, at the moment, reviewing our operational practices in these areas for the reasons he mentions. But let me say that half of the attempted crossings are intercepted by the French on the beach. We have so far, since last January, returned 155 people who have crossed, and we seek to return many more.
Sally Ann Hart.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Migration policy is a core aspect of our national sovereignty. Could my right honourable friend please confirm that the UK will have a fair immigration policy which welcomes people who come to the UK legally, irrespective of nationality or religion, and that we take back control over illegal immigration?
Well, I entirely agree with the point my honourable friend makes, and indeed the similar points made by the member for Dover on this topic. We have a points-based system coming into force shortly. We granted asylum or protection to 20,000 people last year, one of the highest figures in Europe, and we welcomed 3,000 unaccompanied asylum-seeking children, the highest number of any country in Europe. Our legal migration methods are entirely fair. We therefore should be policing with complete effectiveness illegal migration routes, and the Home Secretary and I are determined to do that.
Charles Watley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank my right honourable friend for his earlier answer. But we know that the migrants, as they cross the Channel, are sometimes threatening the French Navy that they will throw themselves or their children into the sea. This is an appalling act, and we need to get the French Navy to step up to the plate and actually take these people off the boats in international waters. What are we doing now to make sure this happens?
Well, discussions are underway between the UK government and the French government. Indeed, I'm speaking to my opposite number, the French Deputy Interior Minister, Monsieur Nunez, on Thursday of this week. But there is more we're doing as well, including working with the French OCRIES, the French gendarmes, the PAF, the Police aux Frontières, to make sure that as many of these embarkations are stopped before they even get onto the water. About 50% are stopped already before they even get onto the water. We would like that number to be a great deal higher.
We now come to Olivia Blake.
Question 19, Mr. Speaker.
Home Secretary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, with your permission, I would like to group this question with 20. The Home Office is committed to rooting out hate crime across our society, and we are in continued conversations and discussions with the police and partners across government to ensure that these criminals face justice. The government has a zero-tolerant approach to the vicious misinformation that seeks to blame any race or religion for the spread of all sorts of coronavirus rumours and misinformation, deliberately spreading false information in order to undermine our respect and tolerance for each other has been disgraceful, and obviously we are working across government to stamp this out.
Olivia Blake.
Last month in South Yorkshire, there was a tripling in hate crime, and even more shockingly, a doubling in the amount directed at East or South Asian descent. Muslim communities have also been attacked and singled out over Ramadan and Eid. What engagement has she had, Mr. Speaker, with those communities at risk?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd say to the Honourable Lady, first of all, the figures that she has quoted are simply shocking, disgraceful and unacceptable. And it speaks to individuals, a small minority, and their lack of tolerance and respect for the communities that she refers to. She has specifically asked me the engagement that I have had, but of course across government we are engaging in the Home Office as well, with different groups, different leaders of organisations, at a ministerial level, but also at an individual level as well. And what I would say to the Honourable Lady and to all colleagues here, we absolutely condemn the appalling racial discrimination, hateful way in which misinformation has been spread, but also the way in which this has been targeted against specific communities.
Question 20, Mr. Speaker. Oh, just question, okay. As we're all aware, there has been a disproportionate number of deaths of black people as a result of the coronavirus, with a number of equality organisations raising concerns about closed online groups mobilising to incite hatred and violence against communities who are becoming COVID-19 scapegoats. Stop Hate UK claim the real number of hate crimes is likely to be much higher, as incidents against people and places of worship are significantly underreported. And can the Minister confirm what specific plans have been put in place to proactively address the feared increase in hate crime?
I thank the Honourable Lady for her very, very important question and the points that she has made. Any form of hate crime is, of course, completely unacceptable, and we expect the perpetrators of such crimes to be brought to justice. And I would suggest and ask anybody who is a victim to ensure that they do engage with the police and have crimes reported. In terms of the government's response and working across government, obviously the Home Office and MHCLG continue to work carefully with the National Police Chief Council, importantly to ensure that all police forces are providing the assistance, and we police by consent in this country, but providing the assistance to communities, community organisations, having the right kind of dialogue and support, but also encouraging that hate crime throughout this pandemic, there are no excuses, are reported. And I myself, and across police and across government, we continue to work with civil society partners. That is absolutely the right thing to do, and we'll continue to do so.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As the Secretary of State has mentioned, there has been a sharp increase in online hate crime during the coronavirus lockdown. Organisations providing advice and support for victims are predicting a big surge in hate crime following the relaxation of lockdown measures. So can the Secretary of State tell me what steps the government is taking to introduce counter-messaging for religious, ethnic and LGBT+ groups who fear an escalation in hate attacks, and what additional funding will be given to those organisations responding to increased demand for advice and support?
I thank the Honourable Gentleman for his question, and he's right to ask about the cross-government work that we do and support for organisations, both within the Home Office but with MHCLG as well. It's clear particularly we see a lot of this activity take place online. We are absolutely making sure that we can tackle that. We do have robust legislation in place to deal with cyber attacks, internet trolls, harassments and perpetrators of grossly offensive and menacing obscene behaviour. We will continue to do that. But of course through other means, places of worship funds and other activities across government, and we will absolutely continue to make sure that they are resourced in the right way, but importantly that we continue that community engagement and dialogue.
Catherine West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Question 22.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, I've been making an assessment of this matter in recent weeks, and following publication of the most recent ONS data, I can announce to the House today that with effect from the 15th of June, the asylum support rate will be increased from £37.75 a week by 5% up to £39.60 a week. That is about 5 times higher than the prevailing rate of inflation, which is currently 0.8%.
From West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's rather an ungenerous increase, I have to say, given that it can be as low as £37 a day for certain people seeking asylum. However, any increase is something which I welcome. And could he tell me whether he could live on under £40 a day?
Well, it's per week. The rate is £39.60 per week. And it's calculated by methodology which is approved by the courts, and it is done with reference to ONS data based on the incomes of people in the bottom 10% of the population. So it's done with reference to figures by a court-approved method, and that is the right way to fix this thing. And I say again, a 5% increase is very substantially higher than inflation.
Butler. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Question number 23.
Mr. Speaker, by your grace, I'd like to group this question with question 24, please. The government is, of course, committed to delivering an extra 20,000 police officers over the next 3 years and putting violent criminals behind bars for longer. That is why we are giving the police literally wheelbarrows full of cash, £700 million this year to help with the recruitment of 6,000 additional officers by the end of March 2021. 3,005 of these extra officers have already been recruited.
Butler. I thank the Minister for his answer. May I first congratulate and ask him to join me in so doing all of Aylesbury's police for ensuring that the Black Lives Matter march in the town on Saturday passed off peacefully, thanks also due to the cooperation of the organisers and the community partners. Having recently been on a socially distanced patrol with the police superintendent in Aylesbury, I know the increase in officer numbers and the cash that he referred to will be very much appreciated. Can my honourable friend assure me that the process of additional recruitment will be sustained despite the undoubted pressures on the public purse due to coronavirus?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I share the honourable gentleman's congratulations to his police force for the peaceful passing off of the protests in his area on Saturday. And can I thank him for, in his first few months as a member in this House, taking the trouble to spend some time with his local police. It's always informative, and I would urge all members to do the same. Of all the promises that were made at the general election, I know that delivering Brexit and delivering 20,000 police officers are the two closest to the Prime Minister's heart, and with confidence I can therefore say we will complete that task in the time allotted.
Powell. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to take the opportunity to place on record my thanks to Jo Farrell, the Chief Constable of Durham and Darlington Police Force, for the calm and controlled way that her force, and in particular her excellent weekly virtual briefings that she's done across party to make sure that the MPs and council leaders are up to speed. In recent calls, one point of concern has been the frustrations that arise from the delays in restarting court proceedings. Can I ask the Minister to further encourage the Minister of Justice to do everything possible to find a safe way to get as much progress as possible on reopening the courts so that all of our police forces result in criminals being dealt with?
Mr. Speaker, can I join the honourable gentleman in offering my congratulations to his local police force and Chief Constable for the work they've done throughout the lockdown. The police force across the entire country has done a fantastic job and remained remarkably resilient throughout the last few difficult weeks. He is quite right that the impact of the crisis on the courts has been profound and has resulted in the workload, the caseload, if you like, rising quite significantly. Double-hatted as I am between the Home Office and the MOJ gives me a ringside seat at creating a recovery plan for the courts. And on Friday, I held a meeting between the Court Service, the Lord Chancellor, and Chief Constables from across the country to start to outline to them what the recovery plan was, and I'm confident that it will be put in place quite soon.
Minister Surridge.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As the Shadow Home Secretary said earlier, the issues around the horrific killing of George Floyd and the protests at the weekend will be dealt with in a statement later this afternoon. I'd like to ask the Minister about his wheelbarrows full of cash. We wrote, Mr. Speaker, to the Home Secretary, along with many police and crime commissioners in early May, in response to a letter from the policing minister to a PCC suggesting that funding for recruitment of the first tranche of the 20,000 additional police officers promised by the Prime Minister be repurposed to fund COVID-19 pressures. So can the Minister confirm today categorically that that letter was incorrect and that funding funding for recruitment of those desperately needed additional staff will not be diverted, and that the wheelbarrows full of cash will continue to recruit those 20,000 police as promised?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm grateful to the Honourable Lady for allowing me to clear up what is obviously a misunderstanding. I held throughout the crisis, I've held weekly calls with police and crime commissioners from across the country to talk to them about the issues that they're facing. One of the issues that was brought to us relatively early was the issue of cash flow. Obviously, a number of forces have faced additional costs during the crisis and felt that their cash flow, not the absolute cost, but their cash flow might come under pressure. We therefore agreed to a number of measures, not least advancement of the pension grant and indeed the early delivery of half of the ring fence on recruitment to ease that cash flow. That is a separate issue from the overall cost, and our discussions with the Treasury about that cost and with police and crime commissioners are ongoing.
Rachel Maskell.
26, please.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As we battle coronavirus, I'm in constant contact with law enforcement leads alongside with the policing minister. And we have listened to their needs from the start and empowered our outstanding police officers and forces to reduce the spread of coronavirus and save lives. And of course, central to that, Mr. Speaker, are the social distancing measures. And the police continue to work constructively across all our communities to engage, explain, encourage, and of course, enforcement is the last resort.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There is so much confusion now about social distancing, despite just guidance given, whereas in Wales, legislation was made to give police the powers they need to put this in place. So what discussions has the Home Secretary had with Cabinet colleagues to introduce similar legislation now, particularly as we're seeing lockdown lifted and more danger being presented into our communities?
Well, Mr. Speaker, what I would say to the Honourable Lady is, first of all, when it comes to social distancing measures, the government could not have been clearer that we all need to, in order to stop the spread of the virus and control the virus. We do, and from a policing perspective as well, the regulations are very clear in terms of ensuring that we work constructively with our communities to social distance, but also, as I've said, enforcement is the last resort, and the police have the power to issue fines of up to £100 in the first instance. And she will be interested to know that since the 29th of May, 15,000 FPNs have been issued since the 27th of March and the 25th of May. And in Wales, she mentioned 1,300 FPNs have been issued, taking the total for England and Wales to just under 17,000.
Number 27, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As set out in my statement last week in the Commons, the public health measures at the border that are being introduced from today are the latest cross-government measures in our collective response and fight to save lives, protect the British people, and importantly, prevent a second wave of coronavirus. Alongside the Minister for the Cabinet Office, the Secretary of State for Transport, Business and Health, I've worked across government and the devolved administrations with science and industry to carefully, from a cross-government perspective, develop this health policy.
I thank the Home Secretary for her answer, but the reality is that some of the government's response is likely to increase the risk of a second wave, and also it is not clear why the government is not agreeing to a 48-hour fast-track system of quarantining instead of 14 days, which will do damage to our businesses. What steps will she take to ensure that it can be done within 48 hours?
Hear, hear.
Well, Mr. Speaker, first of all, the policy is clear and it has been outlined not just by myself but other colleagues across government. This is a cross-government policy, and she will be aware that the regulations are public health regulations, and in addition to that, the specific measures that clearly have an impact upon the transport sector are being led by the Department of Transport but also other government departments. From a health perspective, because this is all about health, these are public health measures at the border. We are guided not just by the science, but also working with the Department of Health and sage advice and scientific advisors in terms of how this policy has been developed.
Comment again.
Scientists say the quarantine introduced today has come too late. The police say it's unenforceable. The tourism and aviation industry say it will ruin them. And the Home Secretary's own department has said it is very hard to imagine how it will practically work. In contrast, our proposal for a 48-hour testing-led model would be targeted, efficient and keep the country open for business. So can the Home Secretary explain to the House how her plan is better and why the government thinks it's right and everybody else is wrong?
To the honourable gentleman, Mr Speaker, I'd say the following. First of all, this is not my plan. This is a government plan and government policy. And I think in terms of the approach that has been taken, the government has maintained throughout this pandemic that medical and scientific advice in terms of border measures are consistent and are now being applied. And that is why throughout this entire outbreak, across the whole of government, working with every government department, we have brought in and identified the right measures. But he's right to highlight the impact upon business and the economy, which is why I held a round table with the transport sector last week, who raised a number of issues, not just about quarantine, but also about the business costs, issues around business rates, issues around furlough. This is not for one department just to solely address these issues, and it is right that we work across government to look at how we can introduce new measures. And if he will recall from my statement last week and the questions that I answered, I covered potential air bridges, fast testing, immunity passports, how we can digitalise the response at the border. That is a cross-government response, and that is something that all my colleagues across government, led by the Department of Transport and the Department of Health, are currently working on.
Ben Bradshaw.
She claimed again, Mr Speaker, this policy is backed by the science. The Chief Scientific Officer says it's not. So will she please publish today the advice she received from SAGE that led her to introduce this irrational, jobs and holidays destroying measure?
Mr Speaker, I refer the honourable gentleman to the comments that I made in the House last week in terms of the scientific advice from the Home Office's own scientific advisor, and of course that advice will be published.
We're now going to topical questions. We come with question 1, Natalie Alfie.
Question 1, please, Mr Speaker.
Mr Speaker, the remarkable success of Hong Kong is predicated on its freedom, its autonomy, and upon the remarkable industry of its people. The decision by the Chinese National People's Congress to impose a national security law on Hong Kong is a clear breach of China's international obligation and a threat to the freedom of the people of Hong Kong. If China follows through with this legislation, then Britain will not hesitate to act. We will put in place new arrangements to allow those in Hong Kong who hold British national overseas passports to come to the UK, enabling them to live and apply to study and work for extendable periods of 12 months, leading to a pathway to British citizenship. If it proves necessary, the British government will take this step and take it willingly. We will never abandon our commitment to the freedom of Hong Kong and its people.
Ashley Alford.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Newborn babies are put at risk of hypothermia, toddlers stripped of their life jackets and dangled over the side so that to prevent interceptions, pregnant women forced to board at gunpoint. Does the Home Secretary agree with me that it is humanitarian as well as the right thing to do to tackle and put a stop to these ruthless criminal gangs, to return boats to France and to give her the legal powers she needs to put a stop to the small boat crossings once and for all?
Well, my honourable friend is absolutely right, Mr Speaker, and she will know from the discussions that we had even as recently as Friday the extent to which the level of criminality and the exposure and the abuse that is undertaken by people traffickers who are forcing mothers, children onto unseaworthy vessels and the horrendous circumstances that they are put under. My honourable friend, the Immigration Minister, earlier on outlined the approach that this government is taking to tackle the abuses, go after the criminals and the facilitators of this crime. And Mr Speaker, we will not stop pursuing this policy until we absolutely break the pathway that these criminal gangs are using.
Okay.
Mr Speaker, the Home Office says there are 9,000 looked after children and care leavers eligible for EU settled status. To date, 11% of these children have had such status. Why doesn't the Home Office consider a blanket approval for these vulnerable children and spare us all an administrative nightmare and a second Windrush?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd say to the honourable gentleman that when it comes to EU settled status, we are working with local authorities in particular to give them the support that they need. And I hope that particularly in his own constituency and to all honourable and right honourable members across the House, they will continue to work in a constructive manner in this way to ensure that children are granted the settled status that they are due.
Thank you, Patty.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does my right honourable friend agree that the right to protest is a fundamental part of our democracy, but that right does not extend to physically assaulting our heroic police officers? And can she confirm that those perpetrators who assaulted police officers and engaged in public disorder over the last few days will feel the full force of the law?
My honourable friend is absolutely correct. We strongly support the right to protest peacefully, but that does not extend to the violent behaviour that we have witnessed across the country throughout the weekend. And, Mr. Speaker, when it comes to any assault on our brave police, that is completely unacceptable. Any perpetrator should be in absolutely no doubt that they will be arrested and prosecuted. Assaults on emergency workers must be handled with the appropriate severity by the entire criminal justice system in a consistent way. And this government will go even further, as we have committed to consult shortly on doubling the minimum sentence for those who assault an emergency worker to ensure that the sentence truly fits the crime.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, the government needs a refresher course in its own policies. The Prime Minister thinks no recourse to public funds. He doesn't know what it means. And the Equalities Minister and apparently the Home Secretary think it means lots of help and support is available. In Newcastle today, no recourse to public funds means a mother unable to buy food or nappies for her baby, a British citizen in the middle of a pandemic with no public help available. Does the Home Secretary know that? Does she care?
To the honourable lady, she is completely wrong in her categorisation. First of all, public health measures are available right now, in addition to the fact that this is a public health emergency, so it's wrong to assert in the way in which she has done. And also, when it comes to funds, I've outlined the funds, working across government with MHCLG, vital funds, resources that have been provided to local authorities to provide support to people that need that extra support, and that is something that this government is committed to.
We come now, T5 has been withdrawn, so we come to Yvette Cooper.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I know we'll return to the protest issues in the statement shortly. This evening, there will be a television dramatisation of the terrible injustice inflicted on Anthony Bryan by the UK Home Office during the Windrush scandal, and a case that we raised in the Select Committee 2 years ago. Will the Home Secretary agree with the urgency and importance of the government now accepting and acting on all of the recommendations in Wendy Williams' review? And in particular, given the timing of the immigration bill, has she implemented recommendation 7, a review of the hostile environment, including its impact on race equality?
Mr. Speaker, the right honourable lady will be well aware from the statement that I made in the House earlier on this year that when it comes to the Windrush Lessons Learned review, I'm looking at all the recommendations, and I have committed to return to this House to outline those recommendations and also the implementation of them. I think it's really important, Mr. Speaker, for me to say categorically again on the record that review was distressing, and there were many strands in terms of institutional thoughtlessness that were applied to the Home Office. Last week, I think it was Wednesday last week, I met again and had a substantive discussion with the Windrush Advisory Task Force to look at various facets of the review, to discuss the issues around compensation, but also to discuss the measures that do need to continue to be pursued by the Home Office in terms of ways of working. That work is ongoing. That is absolutely ongoing. There are cultural changes that need to be brought to the Home Office as well to understand and to resolve many of the issues that from her own position as chair of the Select Committee, she will be familiar with and her Select Committee covered a few years ago, 2 years ago. And it is important that we give not just the department, but also give myself the time to work with Wendy Williams to bring forward those measures so that we can right the wrongs of the past.
We go over to a virtual Dr. Luke Evans. Dr. Luke Evans.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Just a couple of weeks after I gained the nomination to stand as the Member of Parliament of Bosworth, a young man was literally stabbed to death at the end of my road in Hinckley. What is her department doing to rid us of this horrible scourge of knife crime, both before the COVID-19 outbreak and during it?
Secretary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank my honourable friend for his question and for raising what is a distressing and horrendous case. I think, Mr. Speaker, quite frankly, too many young lives have been lost to knife crime. And that is why we are absolutely continuing in our plans and determination to recruit 20,000 police officers. The Policing Minister has already outlined the way in which that is working and the funds that are being allocated. But importantly, it is right that we have legislated to take more knives off our streets and that our serious violence bill will place a new duty on public agencies to reduce serious violence. And of course, Mr. Speaker, that does mean public agencies coming together at a community level to work to stamp out that violence, but also to provide the right kind of support that young people need in the community to avoid a life of crime and violence and to be protected from these horrible, heinous crimes.
We'll be pleased to hear from a virtual Barry Sherman. Barry Sherman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I only wish I could be with you to ask this question to the Home Secretary. She will know that drugs and the running of drugs is at the heart of so much violence when it occurs in our constituencies. And there was some good money that she's responsible for the violence reduction units, which was very welcome because it enabled police forces to have those extra resources. But it's on a yearly basis. And my police commissioner and my police locally tell me that it needs to be known that they're going to have that money for a number of years to be effective. Would you move on that and help my community and communities?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I thank my right honourable friend for his question, but also for highlighting what are just some of the most shocking aspects of serious violence. And he mentions the violence reduction units that play a phenomenal role when it comes to, at a local level, reducing violent crime. But also he has touched on the issue of drugs, and in particular county line drugs as well. And a lot of the work has been combined, and there's more resources now to police forces specifically for reducing serious violence, for violence reduction units, but also for rolling up county lines. And the right honourable gentleman would be absolutely clear. He will be cognizant and aware of the work that's taking place in his constituency with his Chief Constable and his Police and Crime Commissioner to really make sure that all those strands come together to make sure that we can absolutely tackle the scourge of serious violence.
Gillis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In Stoke-on-Trent North, Kidsgrove and Torque, residents have reported the illegal use of off-road bikes around natural beauty spots like Ford Green Nature Reserve or the football pitches of Kidsgrove lads and dads at Bircham Country Park. Will my right honourable friends join me and local councillor Dave Evans in encouraging my local Police and Crime Commissioner Matthew Ellis to work with the Chief Constable to start taking tougher action on the illegal use of vehicles and confiscate them where the law has repeatedly been broken?
My honourable friend is absolutely right, and of course the rule of law applies to everybody, and in particular I commend the work of his local council colleagues. I commend the work in which he himself has led, but particularly to work with the Chief Constable and continue to urge the Police and Crime Commissioner to tackle this scourge, because any crime of this nature blights communities, and it's communities that are disproportionately affected by this.
Tracy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. While many people completely understood the impact of the strict global lockdown on their personal travel plans, things are beginning to change at destinations across the world. Many of our constituents are due to travel in the next few weeks, but now face potential financial loss because of the lack of clarity over whether the quarantine policy is a refundable reason for cancellation under their insurance policy. So can I ask the Home Secretary what discussions has she had with the insurance industry about cancellations due to the impracticality of quarantine for those about to go abroad, and will she commit to giving her speedy support to travel corridors so that our hard-working constituents can go on the holiday that they've saved for?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Honourable Lady will be well aware of the comments that I made last week about travel corridors, specifically international travel corridors, working across government, so with transport, but also with the FCO, because the travel advice right now is still very clear that all advice is against travel, non-essential travel. But it is important, and the Honourable Lady has made a valid point here about insurance companies, refunds, and some of the financial responsibilities and liabilities. We're working across government Government, as I've said to the House, not just today but last week, to make sure that all these considerations are being actively pursued and discussed. And of course, she will hear from other colleagues in Government who are leading on those policy areas.
We have T12 that's been withdrawn, so we now go to a virtual polling Latham. Polling Latham.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Some charities are reporting a decline in the use of domestic abuse helplines during this lockdown as couples are entrapped with their abusers. This is a particular problem for those victims facing language barriers, where English is not their first language. What steps is the Home Secretary taking to ensure that those victims using their helplines are directed to specialist charities with bilingual call handlers such as Karma Nirvana?
Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend is absolutely right to highlight this, and there has been a great deal of work taking place working with domestic abuse, specialist domestic abuse organisations, and particularly those offering bilingual services. There has been a wide-ranging awareness campaign that has been launched. That is part of the You Are Not Alone campaign, and that is very specifically signposting victims to the specific and practical support that they need. We've provided £2 million to bolster those services, and that is for helplines, specifically for helplines and organisations that can bolster their own technological capacities, but also providing those direct practical skills to ensure victims remain protected.
Flynn.
Mr. Speaker, we learn and understand our history in schools and museums, and we build statues for those who we deem worthy of our adoration. Does the Secretary of State agree that where there is a democratic desire to do so, statues of white men who enslaved and killed black men, women and children can and should be removed from our streets?
The Honourable Gentleman is right to raise this issue, and we live in an open democracy and a free society where we have the means to do that through democratic means at a local level through elected mayors and local councillors. And it is important that those processes are absolutely maintained so that people can have their voices heard, exercise their democratic rights and freedoms, but importantly stay within the rule of the law.
Lee Rowley.
For the question from Member for Aberdeen South, does my right honourable friend agree with so many residents of North East Derbyshire who contacted me over the weekend that violence is never an acceptable method to pursue political ends?
My honourable friend is absolutely right. We are privileged to live in an open democratic country with many values entrenched not just in our constitution but also in a rules-based system. There is no justification for violence at all. And when it comes to exercising people's voices and obviously their particular issues and concerns, there are many avenues through which those voices and concerns can be raised and made at a local council level, and obviously that is the right way to approach these issues.
Topical 16 not here. In order to allow the safe exit of honourable members participating in this item of business and safe arrival of those participating in the next, I am suspending the House for 5 minutes. Order.